You're listening to a production of the National Media Archive. To learn more or volunteer, go to nationalmediaarchive.com.
Let's start at the moment John F. Kennedy stepped into the White House brimming with idealism, ready to assert civilian control over America's military machine. But what if I told you that, behind those polished doors, Kennedy encountered an entirely different reality? See, the U.S. government's public face preached peace, but in private, top brass were far more belligerent. The Cold War's doctrine of mutually assured destruction, think of it as a terrifying game of nuclear chicken, wasn't just theory, it was a blueprint for action. We can win a nuclear war, some generals insisted. Now, you might be thinking, surely no one really believed that, did they? But I'm telling you, the mindset was shockingly real. One general famously quipped, "If 2 Americans and 1 Russian survive, we win." That's the logic of total war, a term meaning war without limits or mercy. JFK was horrified. He'd imagined his job was to avoid nuclear conflict, but here were his own advisors itching for a fight. Power structures he hoped to lead were, in fact, pressuring him for escalation. So let me ask you, what happens when the leader of the free world is surrounded by people who think restraint is weakness? That right there is the seed of the Kennedy crisis. Our first major crisis, the Bay of Pigs invasion. Picture this: JFK, fresh on the job, is handed a plan cooked up by the CIA to train Cuban exiles and topple Castro. It had all the hallmarks of a covert operation: plausible deniability and asymmetric warfare, a fancy term for unconventional tactics. But here's the shocking twist. The CIA expected the plan to fail. Why? Because they counted on Kennedy to send in U.S. troops after the operation went sideways, all to save face. Now, imagine being JFK set up by your own intelligence agency. After the fiasco, he realized he'd been manipulated. That's a textbook example of bureaucratic infighting, where rival agencies use deception to achieve their own ends. You might wonder, why didn't Kennedy just fire everyone? Well, he actually diddy-axed the top 3 CIA officials and started slashing their budget, aiming for a 20% cut. But this was more than a personnel shakeup. It was open season within his own government. The president's real enemy was now within the House. Let's shift from action to anxiety. During this turbulent period, Kennedy read a novel about a military coup in the United States, a chilling what-if scenario. He told friends, "It could happen here, but not on my watch." This wasn't just idle talk. The idea of civil-military relations, that's the balance of power between elected officials and the armed forces, was being tested. The Bay of Pigs had shaken the world's confidence in JFK's leadership. Now imagine a second disaster. Kennedy worried that if another major failure happened, his critics would label him too young and inexperienced, and the military might feel patriotically obligated to intervene. You may ask, were they really ready to overthrow a president? The answer, not quite, but the climate of suspicion was intensifying. The seeds of distrust were planted fertile ground for conspiracy. In this moment, Kennedy saw how quickly the unthinkable military takeover could move from fiction to the edge of reality. Now, let's fast forward to October 1962. A U-2 spy plane, a high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft, snaps photos of Soviet missile sites in Cuba. Nuclear brinkmanship just became real. Imagine the tension. Soviet nuclear weapons just 90 miles from Florida. Kennedy's advisors, both CIA and military, were furious. They demanded airstrikes and invasion. The doctrine of first strike capability, the ability to attack and destroy an enemy's nuclear arsenal before they can respond, was on everyone's lips. But JFK took a different route. Instead of unleashing war, he reached out to Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet leader, through back-channel diplomacy, a secret communication line to avoid escalation. You might wonder, wasn't this dangerous? Wasn't he risking looking weak? Well, yes. But Kennedy believed that restraint, what we call strategic patience, was the only way to avert Armageddon. Against the advice of his most hawkish generals, he bought time and, ultimately, secured a deal. The Soviets would withdraw their missiles if the U.S. promised not to invade Cuba. The world exhaled. Imagine the level of paranoia. After the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy began secretly recording meetings with his own advisors. He even ordered the White House bugged. Why? Because he no longer trusted those closest to him. This is classic counterintelligence, the practice of gathering information to protect against internal threats. Kennedy suspected that his generals and intelligence chiefs were undermining his authority. Let me tell you a story. In one recording, after JFK rejected a plan for a massive attack on Cuba, his generals immediately began plotting how to change his mind the moment he left the room. Now you might be thinking, was Kennedy overreacting? Not at all. He realized that if he followed their advice and catastrophe followed, there'd be no one left to hold them accountable. Classic, plausible deniability in action. This deep mistrust inside the administration shows just how isolated JFK had become a president at odds with the very system he was supposed to command. Let's talk money and power. Over 4 decades, the U.S. spent more than $7 trillion on the Cold War. That's $17 trillion today, or about the size of China's entire economy. Every cent flowed into the hands of the military-industrial complex, a term coined by Eisenhower to describe the tight-knit alliance between defense contractors, the military, and policymakers. Picture it as a feedback loop. More fear, more weapons, more profit. Now ask yourself, why would those profiting from endless conflict want the Cold War to end? Defense contractors built empires on the arms race. Think of it as a perpetual motion machine fueled by government contracts. JFK's budget cuts, nearly halving military spending, were seen as a direct threat. Slashing billions meant taking food off the tables of the most powerful industry in America. So, was it just about ideology, or was it about protecting a river of cash? In many ways, Kennedy wasn't just battling General, she was fighting Wall Street in uniform. June 10, 1963. Kennedy addresses American University. Instead of saber-rattling, he calls for genuine peace, not a Pax Americana enforced by nuclear weapons, but a world where nations coexist. Let's break down 2 key terms. Deterrence, the idea that threats prevent war; disarmament, reducing or eliminating weapons. JFK argues that total war is obsolete because a single nuclear bomb now packs more punch than all the Allied air forces in WWE combined. He challenges Americans to re-examine their attitudes toward the Soviets, calling them people, not monsters. This was political heresy, undermining years of propaganda and fear-mongering. Now imagine you're a defense contractor or a hawkish general. To you, this wasn't just naive, it was dangerous. If the enemy doesn't fear us, what stops them from striking first? But for JFK, the real risk was not making peace. His speech was a line in the Sanda Declaration that the old rules of war no longer applied in the nuclear age. Let's get practical. After his speech, JFK pushed for a limited test ban treaty to outlaw nuclear tests in the atmosphere, underwater, and outer space. This was arms control using treaties to limit the spread of deadly technology. He reached out to Khrushchev, who, deeply moved by JFK's words, agreed to negotiate. The treaty was signed on July 25, 1963, but it still needed Senate approval, a massive political hurdle. You might ask, wouldn't Congress support peace? Not so fast. The military-industrial complex lobbied hard against it, arguing that any limitation on nuclear testing would cripple national security. For JFK, this was the ultimate test of leadership. He told his staff that winning the treaty mattered more than winning re-election. That's conviction, putting principle above politics. And in September 1963, the Senate approved the treaty by a landslide. America had, for the first time, chosen arms control over arms race. But victory came at a price. JFK had drawn the wrath of the most powerful interests in Washington. As 1963 wound down, JFK was looking for his next big move, Vietnam. He confided to aides that, upon returning from Texas, he planned to end U.S. involvement in Vietnam is not worth another American life, he said. Let's clarify 2 terms: escalation, increasing military commitment, and quagmire, a situation that's hard to get out of, like quicksand. Kennedy saw Vietnam as both. But here's where the stakes soared. To the military-industrial complex, peace in Vietnam threatened billions in contracts. To some, it was almost as if JFK was betraying American interests. Now you might ask, could one man really change the course of history? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. But by opposing escalation, Kennedy marked himself as a threat to the status quo. And then, right before he could act, Dallas happened. The nation was shocked, and those who profited from war suddenly were back in the driver's seat. The aftermath of JFK's assassination was a blur of confusion and conspiracy. Lee Harvey Oswald, the alleged lone gunman, was murdered on live television by Jack Ruby, a man whose own conviction was later mysteriously overturned. Here's where two concepts come in: plausible deniability, which lets powerful actors hide their involvement, and deep state, the idea of permanent, unaccountable power beneath the surface. Now, you might be thinking, wasn't it all just a string of coincidences? But as we follow the money and the motives, the pattern becomes hard to ignore. Within 2 years, America was officially at war in Vietnam, exactly what Kennedy had tried to prevent. Let me pose this. If the same forces that pressured JFK survived his death, what else might they have been willing to do to protect their interests? For decades, questions have lingered, fueling skepticism about official accounts. But one thing is clear: the machinery of Warrand, those who benefit, did not skip a beat. JFK's story isn't just history, it's a cautionary tale about secrecy, power, and the ongoing struggle between democracy and the interests of the few. Consider the allegations against the CIA, drug trafficking, covert operations, and manipulation of public opinion. These aren't just conspiracy theories, they're the dark arts of statecraft, with technical terms like black ops and psychological warfare at play. Let me ask, how much of what we know is shaped by what we're allowed to know? When former detectives and intelligence insiders speak out, they reveal a world where the lines between legal and illegal, foreign and domestic, blur. Now, you might be skeptical. Isn't this all too fantastic to believe? But history is full of inconvenient truths kept from the public for decades. So, as we reflect on JFK's legacy, let's remember, the fight for transparency and accountability is never over. It's up to us to keep asking questions, demanding answers, and learning from the past. Stay curious and stay dangerous.